The evening air was crisp as Dr. Maya Richardson's silver SUV glided through the quiet streets of Oak Valley. The sweet sound of her daughter's piano melody from the recital still echoed in her mind. Her husband sat beside her, their two children chattering excitedly in the back seat about getting ice cream to celebrate the perfect performance. Maya glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart swelling with pride at her daughter's beaming face. The streetlights cast a warm glow through the car windows as they drove through their familiar neighborhood. It had been their home for 7 years, a place where they'd built their dreams, their careers, and their family's future. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind them, cutting through the peaceful evening. Maya checked her speed. She'd been driving carefully, especially with the children in the car. Her husband James lowered the classical music playing softly on the radio as she pulled over, her hands steady on the wheel. 2 officers approached, flashlights beamed harsh against the car windows. Maya rolled down her window, maintaining her usual composed demeanor, the same one she carried into courtrooms as the state's leading civil rights attorney. But something felt off about their approach. "License and registration," the first officer demanded, his tone unnecessarily sharp. Maya reached slowly for her purse, explaining her movements clearly. "I'm just getting my documents, officer." The second officer's hand rested on his belt, watching her every move with unwarranted suspicion. The tension grew thicker as they scrutinized her papers. Their questions became increasingly aggressive, despite her calm, professional responses. In the backseat, her children grew quiet, sensing the shift in atmosphere. James discreetly began recording with his phone, his years of corporate crisis management kicking in. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer ordered, hand already reaching for her door. Maya's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "May I ask why?" "I've provided all the requested documentation." The officer's response was to yank her door open. Their neighborhood's peaceful evening erupted into chaos. Maya found herself roughly pulled from her car despite her compliance. Her designer blazer from the recital scraped against the car as they forced her against it. Their children's frightened cries pierced the night air, while James desperately tried to explain who she was. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, phones raised to capture the scene. Maya's designer glasses clattered to the ground as the officers handcuffed her, their actions growing more aggressive with each passing moment. Her daughter's voice cut through the chaos. "Please stop hurting my mommy. She didn't do anything wrong." What started as a family celebration was now unraveling into a nightmare that would soon expose deep-rooted issues within the local police department. But for now, Maya focused on staying calm, knowing her children were watching, knowing this moment would become part of a much larger story about justice, dignity, and the fight for change in their community. The situation grew more tense with each passing second outside the Richardson family's car. More police cruisers arrived, their lights painting the peaceful suburban street in an eerie dance of red and blue. Neighbors stood on their front lawns, phones raised, capturing every moment of the unfolding scene. Maya's husband, James, remained remarkably composed, though his hands shook slightly as he continued filming. His deep voice carried across the growing crowd as he tried reasoning with the officers. "My wife is the chair of the State Bar Association's Civil Rights Committee. This is completely unnecessary." The first officer scoffed, tightening the handcuffs around Maya's wrists. "Everyone's somebody important once they're in cuffs." His partner paced nervously, seeming to realize they might have made a serious mistake. The neighborhood's usual evening quiet was shattered by approaching sirens. Inside the car, the children pressed their faces against the window, tears streaming down their cheeks. The younger one clutched his sister's hand, watching helplessly as their mother stood handcuffed between 2 aggressive officers. Their piano music sheets from the recital lay forgotten on the back seat. A new police car pulled up, and a senior officer stepped out. The instant his eyes landed on Maya, his face drained of color. He recognized her immediately from last month's police reform panel, where she'd been the keynote speaker. His quick stride toward the scene carried urgency. "Release her immediately," the senior officer ordered, his voice carrying authority that broke through the chaos. The officers hesitated, looking confused. "That's Dr. Richardson, you idiots. She literally trained half our department on constitutional rights last spring." The handcuffs came off, but the damage was already done. News vans began appearing at both ends of the street, their bright lights adding to the circus-like atmosphere. Maya rubbed her wrists, her legal mind already cataloging every detail of the incident, every violation of protocol, every moment caught on camera. Neighbors who had been recording everything approached, offering their footage as evidence. Some brought out blankets for the children, who finally emerged from the car, running into their mother's arms. The family embraced tightly, their planned ice cream celebration forgotten in the face of this traumatic experience. The original officers stood awkwardly to the side, their earlier bravado deflated as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. The senior officer was already on his phone, likely calling the police chief. This wasn't going to be a simple incident report. This would become a catalyst for change. As local news reporters began approaching with their microphones ready, Maya held her family close. She knew this moment would become more than just a personal injustice. It would become evidence of the very systemic problems she'd spent her career fighting against. Tomorrow, she would be in her office, turning this painful experience into fuel for meaningful reform. But tonight, she needed to be there for her shaken children, helping them understand why such things still happened in their world, and more importantly, how they could work to change it. The officers who had stopped Maya Richardson's car now faced a storm they never saw coming. The police station buzzed with frantic energy as news of the incident spread like wildfire through their ranks. Their body camera footage only made things worse, clearly showing their aggressive behavior toward a calm, professional woman. The police chief arrived at his office early the next morning to find his phone already exploding with messages. The department's PR team huddled in the conference room, desperately trying to craft a response as social media lit up with video clips from multiple angles. Every major news outlet in the state wanted a comment. Inside the station, the two officers sat in separate rooms, writing their reports. Their faces showed the weight of realizing they'd just become the center of a national conversation about police conduct. Their sergeant paced the hallway, knowing this incident would impact the entire department. Meanwhile, at the Richardson household, Maya's husband gently helped their children get ready for school. The kids were still shaken, especially their daughter, who kept asking why the police had been so mean to Mommy. James explained things as best he could, turning this painful moment into a lesson about standing up for what's right. Maya herself sat in her home office, surrounded by papers and her laptop screen showing dozens of unread emails. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Civil rights organizations, news reporters, and even politicians wanted to hear her story. But her mind kept going back to her children's frightened faces from the night before. She opened her email to find messages of support from colleagues across the legal community. The State Bar Association had already called an emergency meeting. Her inbox included numerous videos from neighbors who'd recorded the incident, each showing a different angle of the unnecessary aggression she'd faced. The incident hit social media like a thunderclap. Videos went viral within hours, showing a respected attorney being roughly handled by police in front of her crying children. Comment sections filled with outrage, particularly from people who recognized Maya from her years of community work and legal advocacy. Local community leaders began organizing a peaceful protest outside the police station. They carried signs demanding accountability and reform, many featuring Maya's professional headshot next to images from the incident. The contrast between her standing in the community and her treatment by police made the story even more powerful. Back at the station, the police chief finally faced the press. Cameras flashed as he announced an immediate investigation into the incident and the officer's conduct. Behind him, protesters' chants could be heard clearly. "Who do you serve? Who do you protect?" The chief knew this wasn't going away with a simple apology or press release. This time, real change would have to come. The mood at the police station grew more intense as the internal affairs investigation kicked into high gear. Officers' past records were pulled, revealing a troubling pattern. The two officers involved in Maya's incident had multiple complaints about aggressive behavior, especially during traffic stops involving minorities. The police chief called an emergency meeting with his command staff. The conference room felt stuffy as they reviewed body camera footage, dash cam videos, and civilian recordings. Each angle showed the same thing: an unnecessary escalation against a respected community member. One senior officer put his head in his hands, muttering, "This could have been avoided with just basic respect." Maya sat in her law office, reviewing the mounting evidence. Her legal team had gathered statements from witnesses, including neighbors who'd recorded the incident. Her assistant brought in another stack of messages from supporters, but Maya's focus remained on her computer screen, where she watched her children's frightened faces in the car footage. Her law firm's phones rang constantly. Other victims of police misconduct reached out, sharing similar stories. Some had faced worse treatment, but lacked Maya's resources and platform to fight back. Each story strengthened her resolve to turn this personal incident into meaningful change. In the police department's break room, younger officers whispered about changes coming down. Some worried about increased scrutiny, while others welcomed the chance for reform. A veteran officer spoke up. "Maybe this is what we needed, a wake-up call from someone they can't ignore." Community meetings sprang up across the city. Church basements and community centers filled with concerned citizens sharing their own encounters with law enforcement. Maya attended these meetings not as a victim, but as a listener, gathering stories and evidence of a broader problem that needed fixing. The mayor's office issued a statement promising a thorough review of police practices. Behind closed doors, city officials scrambled to address the growing crisis. The incident had exposed deep-rooted issues they could no longer ignore or downplay. Local news channels ran special reports examining police training and bias. They interviewed experts who explained how even brief encounters could traumatize families. Maya's case became a launching point for broader discussions about community policing and accountability. Videos of the incident continued spreading online, reaching millions. Each share came with comments from people who'd faced similar treatment, but never had their stories heard. The incident was becoming more than just one family's trauma. It was becoming a movement for change. The afternoon brought more developments as independent investigators arrived at the police station. They carried boxes of files, ready to begin a deep dive into departmental practices. Everyone knew this investigation would be different. This time, there was too much evidence, too much attention, and too much at stake to sweep anything under the rug. The tension at the police station reached its peak as Maya Richardson stood in front of the Internal Affairs Board. Her presence commanded attention, dressed in her courtroom best, but this time she wasn't representing a client. She was the victim. The room fell silent as body camera footage played on the wall screen, showing every moment of that night's unnecessary aggression. The two officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as their own actions played out before them. Their faces showed a mix of shame and defensiveness as they watched themselves escalate a routine traffic stop into a civil rights violation. The department's lawyer kept making notes, his pen moving faster with each concerning detail. Outside, the protests had grown larger. People from all walks of life gathered, holding signs and sharing stories of their own encounters with police. Local business owners provided water and snacks to the protesters, showing their silent support for change. The crowd's energy wasn't angry. It was determined. Maya's phone buzzed with a message from her husband. Their children's school had organized special counseling sessions to help students process what happened. Their daughter had spoken up in class, turning her fear into powerful words about fairness and respect. The teacher's message praised her courage. Back in the hearing room, evidence mounted. The investigative team presented a detailed timeline of events, supported by multiple camera angles and witness statements. Each new piece of evidence made the officers' actions look worse. Their previous complaints from other traffic stops painted a clear pattern of behavior. The police chief's face grew grimmer as more details emerged. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about systemic issues that had been ignored for too long. His department's reputation hung by a thread, and he knew surface-level changes wouldn't be enough this time. Local media camped outside the station, capturing every person who entered or left the hearing. They interviewed community leaders who spoke about the broader impact of police misconduct. Social media continued to buzz with updates, as people across the country watched how this department would handle clear evidence of wrongdoing. Inside, Maya presented her own testimony with the same skill she'd used to win countless cases. But this time, her voice carried extra weight. The weight of personal experience, of her children's tears, of countless others who'd faced similar treatment without her platform to fight back. The hearing stretched into the afternoon, but everyone could sense where this was heading. The evidence was too clear, the witnesses too credible, the video footage too damning. This case would become a turning point for the department, one that would lead to real changes in training, accountability, and community relations. The Internal Affairs Board sat silently as the senior officer testified. He described arriving at the scene that night, immediately recognizing Dr. Richardson, and the sinking feeling as he realized what his officers had done. His testimony painted a vivid picture of a department in need of serious reform. The board members pored over personnel files, revealing that these officers had received multiple warnings about their conduct. Previous complaints had been filed, but never properly addressed. One board member shook her head, reviewing documentation of similar incidents that had been quietly swept aside. Maya's legal colleagues filled the hearing room's back rows, taking detailed notes. Many had worked with her on police reform cases, but now they watched their friend and mentor turn personal trauma into a catalyst for change. Her composed demeanor made her testimony even more powerful. The police chief faced tough questions about department culture and training. He struggled to explain why previous complaints hadn't led to meaningful changes. Each answer seemed to dig a deeper hole, exposing years of institutional failures to address officer misconduct. A community liaison officer testified about the impact on public trust. She shared how Maya's incident had affected local residents, particularly families who'd lost faith in law enforcement. Her voice cracked as she described children now afraid of police officers they once trusted. The evidence phase concluded with technology experts analyzing the body camera footage. They pointed out moments where de-escalation techniques should have been used, highlighting the officers' aggressive approach from the start. The timeline showed no justification for their actions. Outside, the media reported live updates from the hearing. Local news anchors interviewed civil rights experts who explained the legal implications. Social media buzzed with clips from the testimony, each new detail adding to public demand for accountability. Maya's husband watched from home, supporting their children who were still processing the trauma. Their daughter had drawn pictures in art class about that night, her young mind trying to make sense of what happened to her mother. These drawings would later become powerful symbols of the incident's impact on families. The board moved to deliberations as the sun set. Everyone knew their decision would set precedent for handling future misconduct cases. The stakes were high, not just for the officers involved, but for the entire department's relationship with the community it served. The Internal Affairs Board emerged from their deliberation room after hours of discussion. Their faces were stern as they delivered their verdict. Both officers would face immediate suspension, pending further investigation into their past conduct. The board also recommended a complete overhaul of department training and policies. News of the decision spread quickly through the station. Officers gathered in small groups, discussing the implications. Some welcomed the changes, seeing them as long overdue. Others worried about increased scrutiny, but even they couldn't deny the need for reform after watching the evidence. Maya received the news in her office, surrounded by her legal team. Her phone lit up with messages from supporters and fellow civil rights attorneys. But her first call was to her husband and children, sharing that justice was being served. Her daughter asked if this meant the police would be nicer now. The police chief held a press conference announcing major changes. New training programs would focus on de-escalation and bias awareness. Body camera policies would be strengthened. An independent review board would be established to handle complaints. Most importantly, the department would work directly with community leaders to rebuild trust. The two suspended officers packed up their desks under watchful eyes. Their badges and service weapons were surrendered to Internal Affairs. One officer was overheard admitting to his partner, "We really messed up this time. Can't believe we didn't recognize her." The other remained silent, still processing how one traffic stop had changed everything. City officials scrambled to implement the board's recommendations. The mayor announced special funding for police reform initiatives. Training consultants were hired to revamp department procedures. Community outreach programs were expanded to include regular meetings between officers and residents. Local media covered every development. Reporters interviewed officers who supported the changes, sharing their own frustrations with outdated practices. Civil rights organizations offered assistance in developing new training materials. The story became an example of how one incident could spark meaningful reform. Maya began receiving invitations to speak at police academies about her experience. She saw an opportunity to help shape the next generation of officers. Her story would become required learning in police training, showing how quickly poor judgment could destroy community trust. The evening news showed footage of new training sessions already underway. Officers practiced de-escalation techniques and learned about implicit bias. The same streets where protesters had gathered now hosted community police forums, where residents and officers worked together to build understanding. 3 months after the incident, the changes in the police department were clear and measurable. Complaint rates dropped significantly as new training methods took hold. Officers now wore body cameras that couldn't be turned off during encounters, and monthly reports showed improvements in community relations. Maya's foundation, created from the settlement money, was making real impact. They provided legal support to families who faced similar situations but lacked resources to fight back. Her office became a beacon of hope, helping turn other instances of misconduct into opportunities for reform. The suspended officers completed intensive retraining programs. One chose to retire early, but the other worked to redeem himself, becoming an advocate for change within the department. He now shared his story during training sessions, using his mistakes to teach others about the importance of treating everyone with respect. Community meetings continued, but the tone had shifted. Instead of angry confrontations, these gatherings became productive discussions about improving police services. Officers attended in casual clothes, sharing coffee with residents and building personal connections. Maya's daughter even felt comfortable enough to share her story at one meeting. The police academy's curriculum underwent complete revision. New cadets now spent more time learning about community relations than weapon handling. They studied real cases, including Maya's, to understand how quick judgments could have lasting consequences. Role-playing exercises taught them to check their biases and practice de-escalation. National media picked up the story of transformation. Other cities sent representatives to study the changes. The department that once made headlines for misconduct was becoming a model for reform. Even skeptical community members began noticing differences in how officers conducted themselves. Maya's children showed signs of healing too. Their daughter no longer tensed up at the sight of police cars. She and her brother had visited the station during an open house, meeting officers who demonstrated their new approach to community policing. Their father noticed they smiled more easily now. The city council approved permanent funding for the new programs. Body camera footage from routine stops showed officers consistently using their de-escalation training. Complaints weren't just being investigated. They were being prevented through better training and accountability. A year after that terrifying night, Maya stood at a podium accepting an award for her work in police reform. But her proudest moment came when an officer approached her afterward, saying how her case had changed his entire approach to his job. Real change, she realized, happened one person at a time. 2 years after the incident, Maya Richardson sat in her home office, reviewing the dramatic changes her experience had sparked. The police department had become a national model for reform, with dozens of other cities adopting their training programs and accountability measures. Her foundation had grown beyond its initial mission. They now offered scholarships to law students interested in civil rights work, hoping to build the next generation of advocates. The documentation from her case became required reading in law schools and police academies across the country. The retired officer who'd been involved in her incident now worked alongside her, sharing his perspective at training sessions. His honest acknowledgement of past mistakes and commitment to change helped bridge the gap between law enforcement and community members. Together, they showed how confrontation could transform into collaboration. Maya's children had grown too. Her daughter, now in high school, led youth discussions about police relations and civil rights. The trauma of that night had shaped her into a powerful young advocate. Her son's school project about community policing won first place at the state fair. The changes reached far beyond their city. State lawmakers passed new legislation requiring similar reforms statewide. Body camera footage, de-escalation training, and community oversight became mandatory. Other states began following their lead, creating a ripple effect of positive change. The police department looked different now. New officers reflected the community's diversity. Regular coffee meetings between officers and residents became routine. Crime rates dropped as trust grew. Even traffic stops, like the one that started it all, became opportunities for positive interaction rather than confrontation. Maya's legal practice evolved to focus on preventive measures and policy development. She worked with police departments wanting to implement reforms before incidents occurred. Her approach emphasized collaboration over confrontation, though she remained ready to fight when necessary. The foundation established a yearly award recognizing officers who exemplified the new approach to community policing. The first recipient was a young officer who diffused a tense situation by taking time to listen and understand, preventing what could have been another tragic incident. Looking back, Maya realized that one terrible night had launched thousands of positive changes, not just in policies and procedures, but in hearts and minds. As she watched the sunset from her office window, she smiled, knowing her children would grow up in a community where law enforcement and citizens worked together, not against each other.